What's up, cooks? Welcome to the Car Kitchen. I am the Car Chef, and today we are cooking up another top 10 decks of the week. That's right, we're getting into another top 10 decks of the week, and as usual, we'll go through the top decks that all won tournaments this week, and tournaments with 250 or more people. If one deck won more than one tournament, we won't cover it twice. And if a similar variant won a tournament as well, we will not cover that either. So we'll get through the first couple of decks that actually won tournaments, and then we'll look at some super cool, interesting cooks that made it into tops of big tournaments, again with 250 or more people. So with that being said, let's get in to the first deck. So the first deck we're going to talk about is Pikachu EX and Zeb Striker. This deck and this build, in my opinion, is not just the best Pikachu build in the game, but I think by far it is officially, again, in my opinion, the best deck in the game. It was already one of, if not the best deck before Mythical Island, and now I think it really truly is the best deck. Week after week after week, it just keeps winning tournaments, and not just one but multiple tournaments, and more often or not it either ties for first place for the most tournaments won or wins the most tournaments. And of course, I'm talking about the tournaments that I'm specifically looking at, and that's usually with 250 or more people. So again, 2 weeks ago it won 3 tournaments. Last week it won 3 tournaments, and this week it won 4, and I looked at 12 tournaments, so I'm even looking at more tournaments than I usually do. It seems that these tournaments are getting bigger and more popular as time goes on, so there's more tournaments and more people participating in each of these tournaments. This deck alone, this build, won the Pocket Legends tournament. It won the BEC Executive tournament. It won the Frog EX tournament, and it also won the Ursi Day tournament, which is always the biggest tournament of the week. This week it was just over, I believe, 1,750 people, nearly 1,800 people. And of course, we all know why. Pikachu is super strong. In general, it's just super fast. 2 energy, 90 damage. You're playing 7 basics. You're always getting enough basics onto your bench, so you're always getting that Pikachu EX online. But of course, why this deck or this build is the specifically the best deck for Pikachu right now is because of the Zeb Striker. And it's not just because you can snipe something like a Magikarp, but it's because there's a lot of other decks, not just the Gyarados deck, that's playing Druddigon, but there are a lot of other decks playing Druddigon as well. So that means while that Druddigon sits there, you can avoid getting that rough skin damage put on your active by bringing in your Zeb Striker and just sniping all the way over Druddigon, hitting all the other Pokemon on the bench and getting that snipe damage. This deck plays 2 Zeb Striker, 2 Pikachu, 1 Zapdos. I've been saying this for a while. I don't think you need 2 Zapdos EX in the deck. Let your deck have some more room to be able to play other things, have other options, whether it's trainer cards or Pokemon. And then it's also playing 1 Dedenne, which is always good. You can get that 10 damage in. If you're fighting a Magikarp, you still knock it out, or you can paralyze something else. And then you have the new Electabuzz from Mythical Island, which has the exact same sniping effect as Zeb Striker, so you're just adding more of that sniping to make sure you really do beat those Gyarados decks or those Druddigon decks as much as possible. You're also playing 2 Sabrina, 2 Professor's Research, and 2 Pokeball, super duper standard. X Speed, I would consider super duper standard in this deck as well. And then you're playing 1 Giovanni and 2 Potions, so the Potions are very good because if you do take any chip damage from things like the rough skin from the Druddigon ability, you can heal it back up. Or what you can do is you can play your Giovanni to make sure you knock it out in one shot, so that on the following turn that potion is even more valuable because you won't be attacking into it a second time. Again, I just honest to God believe this deck is the best deck in the game. It works well into almost every single deck. It could two-shot almost anything. It could one-shot a bunch of stuff. It's one of the fastest decks, one of the fastest Pokemon in Pikachu EX that you can get online. It has the most options to be able to fight into the meta. There's of course builds that play things like Raichu to be able to get that huge damage as well. This deck just has so many options. And so with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. So the next deck we're going to talk about is the Gyarados EX Greninja and Druddigon deck. In my opinion, this deck is by far the second best deck in the game, first being Pikachu EX, as I mentioned, then this deck, and then maybe something like a Mewtwo EX. However, this tournament, like Pikachu EX this week, won 4 of the 12 tournaments with 250 or more people that I looked at. It won the Paldea tournament, it won the Victory Road, the Copa Mew number 2, and the Pocket Turtle. And in 2 of those tournaments, the Paldeo and the Pocket Turtle, it didn't only get first, but it also got second as well in both of those tournaments. So it got 6 top 2 finishes in those 4 tournaments, plus another 2 second places. So it actually placed in the finals more than all other decks this week. And how can't it when it's basically the new big bad in the game? It's one of the only cards that could basically one-shot almost every single Pokemon in the game, even though it only does 140, because you have Druddigon and Greninja, which is a huge part of this deck. Not just being able to stall with Druddigon, but because Druddigon gives you extra free damage. That's why we're not really playing things like Giovanni, because Druddigon and Greninja allow you to get those extra damage points onto your opponent's active Pokemon to get those break points and knock him out in one shot. Just one Druddigon or one Greninja free damage with your 140 damage from your Gyarados is knocking out Executor EX and anything under it. So things like Mewtwo, the legendary birds, Starmie, Aerodactyl, Pikachu, anything you can really think of. And no other card except for Charizard can really one-shot any Pokemon in the game, and that spot used to be really reserved for things like Charizard. And now that Gyarados has come in, he's kind of replaced that Charizard deck as being able to be that one deck that can pretty much one-shots anything. Of course, there are other cards that can do this, things like Celebi. However, it really comes down to coin flips, as well as cards that play Mew, but that's only in very specific matchups, being able to one-shot specific Pokemon with their own attacks. This deck can take out any card in the game. And not only that, but Druddigon, as he sits in your active, if you have a Greninja online, like I said in the Zeb Striker build, when facing Druddigon, you can snipe over the Druddigon and hit your opponent's other Pokemon. In this case, what you can do is you can sit behind your own Druddigon and snipe other Pokemon while giving free damage with your Druddigon every time someone attacks into it as well. We're also in this deck, of course, and actually in this build that I have on the screen that won one of the tournaments is only playing 1 Leaf and 1 Misty, which is actually kind of surprising. I would definitely always be playing 2 Leaf. It's just too important to get out that Druddigon. Once you get that Gyarados online, you need to be able to get it in, get that first shot off, start knocking out Pokemon and getting those free prizes, as well as only 1 Misty. I would definitely be playing 2. So I'm not really sure. This build, listen, this is really hard to make a build because you start to run out of deck space. I don't think that the Sabrina is always necessary. The majority of decks actually are not playing Sabrina. They're playing 2 Misty, 2 Leaf, no blue or no Sabrina, but in this case it actually did. But again, it won, like I said, 4 tournaments and got 4 second place finishes as well, so 8 total top 2 finishes this week in 12 tournaments, which is super duper good. And I think by far any deck in the history of Pokemon, not just Pocket, that can basically one-shot Pokemon always ends up doing really well, and it's no different here. Charizard has always been doing very good, at least before this. It's still doing good now, not as well, and now we start to see it in Gyarados just being able to one-shot every single thing in the game. Once you get it online and you get everything going, you're basically going to win the game. But anyways, with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. So this is the next deck we're looking at, and it's another Gyarados deck, but this deck won a tournament this week with 250 people, exactly 250 people actually. It was the Team Rocket deck, Rocket tournament, sorry, and it's a Gyarados Druddigon deck, but with no Greninja. And so what they've done is they've replaced the Greninja with a Tauros, which is kind of cool because once you remove the Greninja and add in the 2 Tauros, you've basically opened up 4 additional spots in your deck to be able to play other cards. As we mentioned in the last deck, the actual Greninja version of this, they were only playing 1 Leaf, 1 Misty, because instead of playing 2 each, they wanted to play a Blue and a Sabrina. However, in this deck, you can play both the Sabrina Blue as well as the 2 copies of each of the Misty and the Leaf. And because we're not playing Greninja, we are now playing the Giovannis to really make sure we are hitting those breakpoints. We've already talked about all those breakpoints with Gyarados, but with Tauros, it's really important as well because Tauros, for those who don't know, does 100, or I should say, does 40 damage, and then if you're attacking into an EX Pokemon, it does 80 more, so a total of 120. That knocks out something like a Pikachu. With Giovanni, that's 130, knocking out things like Mew EX and Celebi EX. With 1 Druddigon Rough Skin and your Tauros, that's 140. That's knocking out things like Articuno, Aerodactyl, things like Wigglytuff. And then with both the combination of 1 Druddigon Rough Skin as well as a Giovanni, that's 150 total with your Tauros. That's a Mewtwo. And then if you combine multiples of Druddigon, you can start getting up to those bigger Pokemon. It's going to be really hard to be able to hit those 180 Pokemon. However, that is why your Gyarados is there. However, the one thing I do not like is because we're not playing Greninja, basically it would be like 1 Druddigon, 1 Giovanni is like most cases best, like the most common scenario you'll probably see. That's 30 plus the 140 from Gyarados. That's not 180 damage. So in the mirror match, I don't like this deck so much. Or in any mirror match, Gyarados EX versus Gyarados EX, I don't like that because you're not knocking out those Gyarados EX. You are still knocking out things like Charizard because, of course, of weakness, but you're not really strong in the mirror match, and this is a super duper popular deck. But this deck did win again the Team Rocket tournament with 250 more people, so had a pretty cool showing and allowed you to be able to play all those cards that I had mentioned previously you were not able to play in the other Gyarados build. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So this is the next deck, and it's the Charizard EX, Arcanine EX, and Moltres EX deck. And this deck won 2 tournaments this week. It won the Fox Cave tournament and the Pocket Aces tournament. In fact, in Pocket Aces, we got first and second. So it actually had 3 top 2 finishes this week in 250 or more people person tournament. And this deck is still doing pretty good. I mean, it was, we all figured it out in the Genetic Apex period of time. And ever since Mythical Island came out, the deck hasn't changed that much. I have seen people try to put a Mew EX in this deck. with the Charizard and the Arcanine. I don't agree with it. I think this deck is already a little too EX heavy. As you can see, you're playing 6 EX Pokemon. That basically means any of your Pokemon, once fully online, are basically all EX, which is a ton of power, which is a huge pro for this deck. However, it's also a pretty much can sometimes feel like a con when every card in your deck automatically gives 2 prizes. You don't have that ability really to kind of like bring out that single prize Pokemon and kind of let it go so that you can spend some more time trying to build up your strategy, because every other card is a 2 prize card. And then also, if your first Pokemon that you lose is an EX, that's 2 prizes, which most likely it will be because you're playing so many. And then if you only have some single prize in the back, you can basically get Sabrina'd like out of existence. But this deck is super duper strong. Actually, it kind of feels like the last deck we looked at. It has that Gyarados instead of Charizard, which is like that one big dude in your deck that can sweep any card in the game. You have that Arcanine instead of the Tauros that can do the 120 damage, except you can do 120 damage to any Pokemon. And then you have that Moltres that is your lead Pokemon you put out into the front and helps you set up the entire rest of your game. The one thing that has kind of changed in this deck is the existence or addition of Leaf, which is super important because this deck has Arcanine and Moltres, who both require a 2 energy retreat. Both of them, as well as the Charizard. All 3 have 2 retreat cost. And so it's super important, but then you also need to play the X speed, and they are playing the X speed because you do need that Moltres in the front. So you need to be able to, at the beginning of the game, get that either Charmander or something like that out of the front to get the Moltres in. So you're kind of, and that's the one thing about this deck, other than the EX, is you almost feel forced to have to play certain cards, and because the deck already has such small deck space, you can't play other things. In fact, this deck used to and needed to, and probably still does, need to play things like potions because your Arcanine does damage to itself, and there's so much Druddigon and Greninja out there that you need to be able to really heal that thing up so you don't just get knocked out on the following turn. Because again, once that's knocked out, if you loaded up all your energy on that guy and he gets knocked out, your Charizard and your Moltres do not have enough energy at that point to really continue the game, and so you just kind of lose sometimes. But this deck again won 2 tournaments this week, had the Fox Cave tournament, the Pocket Aces tournament, and got 2nd place in the Pocket Aces tournament, so it is still doing very good. And of course, we must talk about Charizard before we move on to the next deck. Again, the strongest card in the game, 200 damage to your face once it's loaded up. There's no way to stop it once it gets going. It will basically sweep your opponent's entire team once it's ready to go, and because it has 180 hit points, it's very hard to knock out, even with something like a Gyarados. But anyways, with that being said, let's move on to the next deck. So the next deck we want to talk about is the Arcanine EX Moltres build. So no Charizard this time. In fact, it's being replaced with the Mew EX, and that's kind of what the Arcanine builds have been doing lately. Is it just takes out the Charizard build, replaces it with the Mew EX, because that Mew EX, if you're facing those big Pokemon that have huge HP but have also large attack, you can just copy it with the Genome Hacking and then knock them out anyways. But what it does, very similar to the Tauros Gyarados build, because it removed the Greninja. In that case, it's removed the Charizard. In this case, you've opened up 4 more spots in your deck, so now you can play those important cards like potions, which I was just talking about for your Arcanine, super duper important. Things like Giovanni to get those break points, which you weren't able to play in the last build, but it's important because you do want to be able to get to that 130 sometimes with your Arcanine. Of course, you're playing, and I think you should be playing 2x speed in almost any Moltres build, because it's super important to The strat, because you need to be able to get it into the front. In this case, they're playing 2 X-Speed, 1 Leaf. I would agree with that. The one thing, again, just like the last build, is this deck plays 6 EX again. I think that's super duper risky. But again, this deck is still won a tournament this week. That's why we're showcasing it. It won the PGR tournament and got first place. It had 250 or more people. And the cool, again, it's kind of a pro and con to this deck. Because you're playing Mew EX, what you can do is you can ramp onto your Arcanine with your Moltres while you manually build the Mew EX, or you can just decide, like in the Charizard build, which one you want to work on. However, the downfall is your Moltres can't ramp on to your Mew EX, so that's kind of frustrating. But at the end of the day, this is still a pretty good deck. So is the Charizard. I'm not a fan of Fire right now. The Fire decks, I just don't think they're as viable as some of the other decks. They obviously probably do pretty good into the grass decks, which are also very popular right now. But in most cases, other decks can do just as much damage to those decks without the weakness anyways. Mewtwo can one-shot something like an Executor EX if it has a Giovanni. Your Druddigon decks, like I said before, can basically one-shot anything, the Gyarados decks. Your Pikachu EX, could basically two-shot anything and gets online so fast that you most likely are going to two-shot almost any single thing in the game. So I just think there's better decks than the Fire decks right now, but they are still doing very good. So if it is your style of play and you like them and you want to try and get that guaranteed humongous damage, then the Charizard build is for you. If you like a bit of a more variety build, this would be this, because you open up more deck slots. So again, these decks are still good, still viable, just not as much so as the other decks. But that's it for the decks that won tournaments this week. Now let's get into some of the builds that were super duper cool cooks this week that topped in tournaments with 250 or more people. So this is the next deck we want to talk about, and it's an Executor, and not Celebi EX, a Mew EX deck that plays the 2 Executor EX, the 2 Baby Executor from Genetic Apex, 1 Mew EX, and 1 Farfetch. So I have had a similar deck to this on the top 10s before. However, it did play a Celebi EX, and I had mentioned it was one of my favorite builds of Celebi because I did not like, I do like, but not as much, playing the Superior in the deck as a ton of value that you get out of that Superior. I really like the no Superior build. In fact, we didn't talk about any Superior builds this week. They did not win any tournaments, but this deck did get 10th place in the Victory Road tournament that had 500 or more people in it, and I thought this was a super duper interesting build. And last time when we had a similar build to this with the Celebi EX, I said that I liked it because it felt very similar to the old school Executor Venusaur build, because basically what you would do is you would tank with one of your Executors while you slowly build up that Venusaur in the back. Except in this case, what you're doing is instead of evolving into a stage 2, you have a basic Pokemon, either the Celebi EX or the Mew EX, in this case only the Mew EX. So I guess this player felt like the Celebi was not necessary. However, I would be playing it in this deck if it was me, because again, what you do is you tank with that baby Executor at the beginning of the game, so that if it does get knocked out, you're only giving up a single prize, so that you have a lot more time to possibly bring in a second baby Executor, get that one knocked out, and then bring in your big guy at the end of the game to try and sweep the game. The reason I don't like the fact that this doesn't play Celebi is because if the really big attacker that you only have in this deck is Mew EX, then you don't have those matchups where Mew EX will do very well, then you can sometimes just straight up lose the game. So I do think at least one Celebi EX in this deck would improve it that much more. But again, it did get top 10 in a 500-person tournament, so that has something to say for this deck. And again, I actually do like this style of build. The fact that you can build a tank with your Executor, whether it's the baby or the EX, get a ton of chip damage for just one energy while you build up the rest of the energy on one big Pokemon in the back, is very, very valuable. Again, very similar to the old Venusaur EX builds, where instead of now evolving into a stage 2, you just have a basic Pokemon that you can fill up with a ton of energy and then bring in once it's ready, and then just start trying to sweep the game. But anyways, with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. So this is the next deck, and it's another Gengar EX deck. Last week in the top 10 list, we had a Gengar EX deck that finished 4th place in a tournament. This week, it finished 12th in the Victory Road tournament. In fact, in that same tournament, there was another Gengar EX deck that got 24th place as well. So 2 Gengar EX decks this week in very high placements in huge tournaments. The Victory Road tournament had more than 500 people, and last week it got 4th place. This week it got 12th. So Gengar EX continues to do well, which is super duper impressive. This week what it did is it played 2 Gengar EX lines with 1 Gengar, baby Gengar, and then 2, I always forget how to say this guy's name. I think it's Siligif or Siligif, and then 1 Mew EX, and then of course all the important trainers. So what I will say right away is I love playing the Sigilyph and Psychic builds. I find it allows you to turbo through your deck a lot faster. You're already playing Professor's Research, Pokeball, and Mythical Slab, and then when you add the Sigilyph on top of that, you're just allowing yourself to kind of turbo through your deck even faster than you otherwise usually would in normal Psychic decks, and then therefore allow yourself to get into that Gengar EX a lot faster, which is why they're playing 2 Gengar EX. I always, in my Gengar builds, I always play 2 Gengar EX and 1 baby Gengar. And the reason why I do that, and I'm sure this player did the same reason, is because it's more important to get into the Gengar EX first, and then have your second Gengar line be something like the baby Gengar. So of course you want to see the Gengar EX more often than you do the baby. And then because that takes 3 energy, the Gengar EX, if you build up a second one, you most likely will not be able to get 3 energy on it. And so therefore you're able to evolve into the baby Gengar. Or what you can do is you can decide, depending on the matchup, to build up your Mew EX, bring that in first, start doing a bit of sweeping and getting prizes, and then bring in that Gengar in the end, and then start locking them out of supporters. Again, at this point, I still don't think Gengar EX is top tier. I'm super happy to see it topping in tournaments. However, I do believe, and this was kind of predicted coming out of Genetic Apex going into Mythical Island, that Gengar would probably get a little bit better because there's a lot more important supporters coming out. The card pool is so small right now that to get value out of Gengar EX is very hard to do. The more supporters that come out and more decks rely on certain supporters, and I think that's probably why this is doing very good right now. There are a lot of decks that rely on a lot of mid or late game supporters, things like Leaf to get your Pokemon out, Sabrina to get those late game switches in, even late game Misties, as well as Lieutenant Surges. Things like that you can really kind of put like a stop to certain decks being able to do certain things, and then you're just allowing yourself to lock them out, and then 100 damage is still not that bad. It's not that great either, but it's not that bad, especially in a Psychic deck anyways, even if it is all Psychic requirement. And then you do have a Mew EX to kind of make up for some of the kind of cons of this deck. Again, I still find Gengar EX, it gets online way too late to have any real value out of it, which is why in my Gengar builds I always play something like a Psyduck. Again, though, this deck is playing like the Psychic Toolbox with mythical slabs, so of course Psyducks aren't really reliable in this deck because it could screw up a lot of things for you. But again, this deck allows you to cycle through your deck super duper fast, get those Gengar EX online quicker than you otherwise usually would be able to, so you could try to get some value out of its ability to lock your opponent out of supporters. And then again, the baby Gengar is super important for that second line that you're building, because again, you might not be able to get the 3 energy on it, or you want to be able to focus energy on the Mew EX. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So this is the next deck that we want to talk about, and it's a Pidgeot deck. That's right. This isn't the first time we talked about one of these decks on a top 10 list. The last time we talked about it was again one Pidgeot EX, one Pidgeot, and it was a Blaine's package. In this case, what we've done is we played kind of a tech package. We're playing the Druddigons, Marshadow, and Hitmonlee. And all these cards kind of play very well with each other. For instance, both Pidgeot and Hitmonlee, all three of them pair very well with Pokeflute. So for instance, you can get an early game knockout, and then once they start playing some additional Pokemon on their bench, you play a Pokeflute and you get max value out of your Pidgeot EX. Or what you can do is if they refuse to put Pokemon down on their bench, they're just susceptible to things like your regular Pidgeot, because now what you can do is if they're putting minimal Pokemon down on the bench, you can force out something specific into their active and then attack into that. Or if they play no Pokemon, you can play a Pokeflute and then hit that with something like a Hitmonlee. So what you can actually do is you can knock out a Magikarp with your Hitmonlee, play a Pokeflute, bring it back, and then knock out a second one with a Hitmonlee again. And actually, I'm kind of surprised, and I wouldn't be surprised actually if in the future in those Aerodactyl Primate builds you start to see a one of Pokeflute in those decks, because it gets so much value with your Hitmonlee. And then of course the Pidgeot EX with the Pokeflute is super duper strong with a Druddigon, because again, when the first kind of decks that were being built through Mythical Island, when it came out, a lot of content creators were doing Pidgeot EX Druddigon decks, because Pidgeot EX with 140, if you get the max value out of its attack with Druddigon rough skin damage, that's 160 damage. That's knocking out a ton of Pokemon in the game. So this deck just kind of has a ton of synergy in it. You can get a ton out of attack out of your Pidgeot EX. You can also get a ton of attack out of something like a Marshadow. So this deck is really cool, really interesting, and got in a top 16 in a 250 or more person tournament. And I kind of like to see these builds, and I like to see them reoccurring as well, not just one time but multiple times. And this is the second time I have seen a Pidgeot deck in a top 16 in recent times, so that is pretty cool. But anyways, with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. So this is the next deck we want to talk about, and it's a Marshadow Hitmonlee Farfetch deck, and this is what I like to call a tech box deck. I've talked about tech box decks recently a lot. This deck usually will play things like an Aerodactyl EX, and then sometimes take out the Farfetch and trade it in for a Primeape, or sometimes this deck specifically, without the cards I just mentioned, will also play something like a Tauros, basically setting yourself up to be able to attack into anything with anything at any given time, and basically it's like your choice of what you want to use. So this is very good, because what you can do is you can attack in very early with things like Farfetch, get a ton of prizes, or even just one prize with your Farfetch sometimes is good enough. Or if you're playing things like Magikarp, you can get a free early knockout with your Hitmonlee. And then even if you lose a Farfetch at the beginning of the game, well, guess what? You probably already did 40 damage, if not 50 with the Giovanni. Then you can bring in the Marshadow and do 100 or 110. That would be, if that's 2 Giovannis, that would be 50 from your Farfetch, and then 110. That is 160 damage. That would knock out pretty much anything of relevance in the game. And even if you're not knocking out something like a Gyarados, you may have already knocked out their Magikarp with Hitmonlee, but even if you didn't, you don't knock out the Gyarados, they take out one of yours, but then you get to take out one of theirs for 2 prizes. This is, for all intents and purposes, a single prize deck, even though you are playing a Mew EX, but you're really only putting that Mew EX down if the game calls for it. If you have that matchup where Mew EX needs to come in and gets a ton of value, that kind of Mewtwo EX or Charizard deck that you might be playing. And you're definitely not just playing the Mew EX, because again, you're not even trying to really tank with it. There's nothing you really need to build up in the back. All the energy requirements on your other Pokemon are very minimal, and that's my dog, say hello. And you're also not playing a Button Expeditioner, so you do not you're not really trying to tank with your Mew EX at all. This deck it's not the first time this deck has been around. This is actually kind of a popular deck. It's a really cool deck, and again, I've been calling it, and other decks like this that play a ton of cards that you can tech in so that you can answer any given situation that you're in, which is why I call it tech box. Usually box types of decks are decks that allow you to answer any situation that you're ever in, and this deck does that very, very well. But with that being said, that is it for the top 10 decks of the week. I hope you liked it. Leave a comment in the comment section below. Like, subscribe, and share if you feel so inclined to do so. And with that being said, as always, keep cooking.